Heinous, gruesome and inhumane. The murders which rattled a small New South Wales country town and revealed the darkest evils in humanity. The bigger schoolgirl murders. Welcome to Poetic Justice Podcast. I'm your host Bailey Bowell, and today we will delve into a case that shocked Australia, the Beaker schoolgirl murders. Especially how the case greatly affected law reform, criminal trial process and criminal investigation process. In particular, how those processes in this case upheld society's moral and ethical standards. What are moral and ethical standards? Morals refer to an individual's principles regarding right and wrong, whereas ethics are the collective moral standards of a community, often shaped by cultural norms and legal frameworks. In this sense, moral and ethical standards of society are what individuals in society, and society as a whole, believe is right and wrong. Spoiler alert, these perpetrators did a lot wrong. Let's first start with the facts of the case. This information has been collated through the documentary released by the True Crime Channel on YouTube and by the Supreme Court records in the R.V. Camilleri and R.V. Beckett cases. Bigger teenagers, Lauren Barry and Nicole Collins, were prominent members of the community, and on the 1997 October long weekend, Lauren and Nicole were camping with friends from the local school. The night of the 3rd of October, Lauren and Nicole were interested in attending a party nearby. The two girls decided to walk to the party. At the same time, Leslie Camilleri and Lindsay Beckett were driving in a Ford Telstar nearby. Both Camilleri and Beckett were drinking whilst driving, as well as injecting heroin and crystal methamphetamine, or ice. The two men spotted the two young girls walking along a local road, and after a brief discussion, the two girls willingly entered the vehicle. In order to make space, the two men discarded a pink television they had acquired from somebody indebted to them for a drug-related matter. The group then went to a nearby beach and proceeded to be driven back to the campsite. On the road back to the campsite, Camilleri bottomed out his car and became aggravated. This quickly escalated and led to both Camilleri and Beckett pulling a knife on the two girls and threatening their lives if they attempted to escape. The group then proceeded to a rubbish dump near Kilaru, where both girls were sexually assaulted. The group then proceeded further south into Biala National Park, and the girls were further assaulted. A flashlight and a used tampon were found at the scene. The group then proceeded to the town of Eden, where once again the girls were assaulted, and driven further south towards August, where once again they were sexually assaulted. On the drive, Camilleri fell asleep, and upon waking up he became aggravated at Beckett, claiming he was driving in the wrong direction. The girls began to question if the men were asking if they were going to be murdered, in which Beckett assured them that they were just going to be tied up, which would allow the men time to go into hiding. The final stop was at Fiddler's Green Creek, just south of the Victorian border, at about 8 a.m. the next morning. Camilleri ordered the girls to strip naked and wash themselves in the creek in order to remove evidence of the sexual assaults. The girls were then tied up to trees about 30 metres apart from each other, while Camilleri ordered Beckett to drown them both. Beckett protested, but eventually complied and once threatened with his own life. Beckett began to drown Lauren Barry and became aggravated after struggle and splashing effort by Barry. He then proceeded to slit her throat and stabbed his own thumb in the process. Nicole Collins was killed in a similar manner with 2 to 3 stab wounds in her throat. Following both murders, the two men drove on the Monaro Highway to Canberra and the ACT, where the knives were disposed of in Lake Burley Griffin. The AFP were able to arrest Beckett on prior car theft charges and held him in remand following some evidence that was found in the stolen vehicle. Police then interviewed Camilleri the day after he admitted to having been in possession of a TV which matched the description of the one found on the night of the crime. The police at the time were under guidelines which were outlined in the Crimes Act 1900, New South Wales, as well as the Police Powers Act, in addition to common law principles. This was later amended into the Law Enforcement Powers and Responsibility Act 2002, or LEPRA. With this in mind, the police were close to breaking the two men and getting enough evidence to arrest them. The police worked with Beckett in order to gain the arrest of Camilleri, the obvious ringleader in the heinous acts which happened that night, who was the main target of police at the time. Beckett made a full confession and agreed to take the police to the bodies for a recommendation of a mitigated sentence by the prosecutors to the judge. The police were shown to the side of the bodies, as well as shown step by step the events of the night per Beckett's story. After being informed of Beckett's confession, Camilleri profusely denied any involvement in the crime and claimed that Beckett was the sole perpetrator in the murders. The police, unconvinced of his claims and certain on Camilleri's guilt, pressed charges for the kidnapping, rape, and murder of both girls. The same was done for Beckett, but with the promise of a recommendation of a mitigated sentence. The actions taken by the police that day were a direct effect of the police force's aim to deliver justice to the community, the victims' families, and to the offenders. Some people were concerned over the cooperation and requests for mitigated sentences that the police brought forth into the courts. The police argued that without the cooperation by Beckett, the case could not have secured a guilty verdict, as the forensic evidence alone might not have been enough. Overall, this case shows that the criminal investigation process was upholding the moral and ethical standards shown by society, who are adamant on keeping these dangerous men out of the community. Following his arrest, Camilleri pleaded not guilty at his initial hearing and had a criminal trial in the Supreme Court of Victoria, who had original jurisdiction over serious indictable criminal offences such as this one. He maintained his claim that he was so heavily influenced by the heroin and methamphetamine that he was by no means under control of his body, and in fact claimed that he could not even move, therefore unable to commit the acts. During the trial, his partner in crime, Beckett, took a stand against him and was in the witness box for 5 days of trial. Other evidence included a shirt which contained his semen at one of the sites in which the girls were raped. Another piece of evidence was a TV which Camilleri admitted to having in the initial interviews with police. The evidence provided aligned with the rules outlined in the Evidence Act of 1996. The sheer amount of evidence stacked against Camilleri and the fact the other perpetrator had turned on him throughout the process ultimately led to his guilty verdict. This verdict was made by a jury, which were members of the nearby community where it happened. Juries are a group of people randomly selected by the courts to determine the guilt of a person. They are instructed only to find someone guilty if the standard of proof is beyond reasonable doubt, and if the proof did not meet this standard, then to follow the presumption of innocence. The jury is meant to be a fair representation of society and ultimately make the verdict on society's behalf. This means the verdict certainly reflected society's moral and ethical standards and again showed society's hatred of crimes like these which stripped victims of dignity and humanity. Camilleri received a life sentence without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would never be reintegrated into society. The judge made these remarks while delivering his sentence. Using the control which he clearly had over the weaker-willed but equally evil companion, Beckett, you instructed him to perform acts that, in a somewhat perverse way, it could be said that you probably did not possess the courage to perform yourself. It is terrible to contemplate the prospect that, as a consequence of the order which, in my view, justice and a proper appreciation of sentencing principles would require in your case, you may never be released from prison. However, I consider that my duty is clear. Through your own actions, you have forfeited your right to ever walk amongst us again. The judge made his decision in accordance with Crime Sentencing Procedure Act 1999 and outlined retribution, the idea that there is a required punishment for committing an act almost like an eye for an eye, and incapacitation, stopping the perpetrator from walking amongst society ever again, as the main purposes for the very severe punishments for both men. Beckett pleaded guilty during his trial and was sentenced to life imprisonment with a non-parole period of 35 years. A reflection on his cooperation with police, but also a harsh sentence as to keep him out of society and keep the community safe and free of convicted violent offenders. The trials and sentencing of Camilleri and Beckett are true indicators of how the criminal trial process and sentencing and punishment can uphold society's values and ethics, especially of society's zero tolerance to these serious indictable crimes. It is also noted that Camilleri had his case appealed at the High Court of Australia, who upheld the ruling of the Supreme Court. Following the conclusion of this case, New South Wales legislators highlighted the fact that bail laws needed to be tightened in order to restrict violent criminals from walking amongst society. New South Wales Parliament created the Bail Amendment Act 1998, which outlines tighter restrictions on bail for those who have been charged with and or found guilty of violent sexual abuse in the past, especially abuse to a minor, as well as kidnapping and wounding with intent on bodily harm. Specifically, the changes were so those who had committed violent sexual crime in the past were not favoured in bail hearings, and in fact, in most cases, needed to be remanded to protect society from the dangerous accused criminals. Nicole Collins and Lauren Barry's murders were the catalyst of this change, and community support for law reform was very much welcome as to prevent another heinous attack from occurring again. To conclude, the murders of Lauren Barry and Nicole Collins were heinous and hideous acts against humanity by Leslie Camilleri and Lindsay Beckett. The sheer severity of the case set into motion law reform, which tightened bail restrictions for violent sexual offenders. Additionally, the police during the criminal investigation process and the courts during the criminal trial process diligently followed all the legislation and common law rules in order to reflect society's morals and ethics and ultimately leave both evil men in prison where they belong.